Locked in a cellar filled with toxic fumes, he had 48 hours to prove his master was a murderer, using nothing but a silver goblet. Welcome to the Whispered Histories. Silus Thorne forced his butler to polish the family silver with raw mercury until the man's lungs burned. He believed the toxic fumes would kill the only witness to his crimes before the truth could surface. But the master made one fatal mistake. The silver goblet held a stain that no chemical could wash away. Every breath in that locked room brings Elias closer to death. But he isn't just cleaning, he is gathering evidence. By the end of this, the very treasure Thorne prizes will be the weight that sinks him to the gallows. What the master didn't realize was that the silver doesn't lie, even when the man holding it is forced into silence. The Mississippi Delta in the late summer is a place where the air itself feels like a wet shroud. On the Thorne plantation, the humidity doesn't just cling to your skin. It carries the scent of rot from the river and the heavy sweet smell of magnolia that masked the stench of the slave quarters. But inside the big house, the air was different. It was cold, sharp, and smelled of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of old money. Elias had lived in that house for 38 years. He knew the creak of every floorboard, and the exact moment Silus Thorne's mood would shift from a simmering anger to a violent boil. Elias was a man of quiet observation. He had to be. In a world where a wrong look could cost you your skin, he had learned to see everything without ever appearing to look. He had a steady hand and a nose that could pick out the scent of rain hours before the first drop fell. He also knew the difference between the smell of a natural death and one that was helped along by human hands. That was the problem. That was why he was currently standing in the dim light of the back pantry, staring at a jar of cleaning paste that looked like liquid moonlight and smelled like a slow death. Silus Thorne stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. Silus was 50 years old, a man whose wealth had grown even as his soul shriveled. His face was a map of broken veins and arrogance. But lately something else had been written there. His hands were shaking. It wasn't just the tremors of an alcoholic, though the whiskey bottle was never far from his reach. It was a rhythmic neurological twitch that made the gold rings on his fingers click against each other. Silus watched Elias with a gaze that was both paranoid and predatory. He needed Elias gone, but he couldn't just hang him or sell him off. Not yet. Not while the memory of his younger brother, Julian, was still fresh in the minds of the county officials. Julian Thorne had been the favorite. He was younger, kender, and he was the one who was supposed to inherit the bulk of the estate according to their father's will. But 6 months ago, Julian had died of a sudden fever. At least that was the story Silus told the doctor. Elias knew better. He had been the one to clear the table that night. He had seen the way Julian's face had twisted in agony after the final toast. He had seen the ceremonial silver goblet, the pride of the Thorne lineage, sitting empty by Julian's hand, and he had seen Silus's face, not a mask of grief, but one of intense, shivering relief. Now Silus wanted that goblet clean, not just clean, but blindingly bright, for the arrival of Judge Sterling. The judge was a man of the law, a rigid traditionalist, who was coming to the plantation for the seasonal hunt. Silus knew that if the judge sought the Thorne silver looking anything less than perfect, it would be a slight against the family name. But there was a deeper reason for the sudden urgency. Silus knew that as long as that goblet sat in the cabinet, it held the ghost of his brother. He believed that if he could just scrub it hard enough, if he could use the most powerful chemicals he could find, the evidence of what had been in that wine would vanish forever. The problem was that the silver paste Silus had provided wasn't just a cleaner. It was a mixture laced with raw mercury. Silus had told Elias it was a secret formula from a chemist in New Orleans, something to make the silver shine like the sun. But Elias knew the smell. He knew the way mercury behaved. He knew that in a closed room without a breeze to carry the vapors away, those fumes would settle in a man's lungs and turn them to stone. He knew that the tremors Silus was experiencing were the first signs of the poison he himself had been handling to prepare the mixture. Silus was killing himself to kill his butler, and he was too arrogant to realize it. Silus stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He held out a heavy iron key. "Take the silver to the cellar room. Elias," he said, his voice raspy and thin. "I want every piece polished, every fork, every tray, and especially the ceremonial goblet. Don't come out until it's finished. I want to see my face reflected in the metal. Do you hear me?" Elias took the key. His fingers touched the master's cold, damp hand. The tremors were worse today. Silas's eyes were bloodshot, the pupils pinned pricks of dark suspicion. "I'll do it, Master Thorne," Elias said quietly. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. He could feel the weight of the death sentence Silus was handing him. The cellar room was a tomb of stone and damp earth. It was located deep beneath the kitchen, a place where the heat of the Mississippi sun couldn't reach, but where the air was stagnant and heavy. There were no windows, only a heavy oak door with a small iron grate that offered no real ventilation. Elias carried the heavy chest of silver and the jar of toxic paste down the narrow stairs. He heard the door close behind him. The sound of the key turning in the lock was a final cold click. He was alone with the silver, the poison, and the truth. He set the jar on a rough wooden table. Beside it, he laid out the Thorne silver. It was a massive collection, pieces that had been in the family for generations. But his eyes went straight to the goblet. It was a heavy, ornate piece of craftsmanship decorated with vines and the family crest. To anyone else, it looked like a masterpiece. To Elias, it looked like a weapon. He picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the metal. At the very bottom of the cup, there was a faint, dull discoloration. To a casual observer, it was just a bit of tarnish. To Elias, who had spent a lifetime maintaining this house, it was a shadow. He knew that Silus had used arsenic to kill Julian. He had seen the small vial in the master's study weeks before the fever struck. What Silus didn't know, what his greed and panic had blinded him to, was that arsenic leaves a residue that reacts with certain minerals. And when that residue meets mercury, it doesn't wash away. It creates a chemical map of the crime. As Elias opened the jar of paste, the sharp, sweet metallic scent hit him. It made his eyes water instantly. His chest felt tight, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his ribs. He knew he didn't have much time. The mercury would work slowly, clouding his mind and making his hands shake until he couldn't hold a rag. But the fumes would do the damage first. He began to work. He took a soft cloth and dipped it into the shimmering grey paste. The first few pieces of silver, the forks and spoons, shined up beautifully. They looked like mirrors reflecting the flickering light of the single candle on the table. But as he worked, the air in the small room became thicker. Every breath felt like inhaling fine sand. Elias could feel a dull ache starting behind his eyes. He thought of Clara, the housekeeper. She had been there that night too. She had seen Silus switching the wine decanters. She was terrified, hiding in the shadows of the kitchen, her eyes wide with a secret she didn't dare speak. She knew that if Elias died in this cellar, she would be the next one the master looked at with those paranoid, bloodshot eyes. Elias looked at the door. He knew Toby, the young stable boy, would be outside eventually to move the used rags. Silus had told Toby to take the rags and burn them far from the house, claiming they were diseased. It was a clever way to destroy the evidence of the mercury. But Toby was a smart lad. He looked up to Elias. If Elias could just last long enough to give Toby a sign, a trail to follow, maybe there was a chance. But the task at hand was the goblet. Elias reached for it, his fingers already beginning to tingle with a strange numbness. He dipped the rag deep into the mercury paste and began to rub the bottom of the cup. He expected the tarnish to vanish. He expected the silver to emerge, bright and mocking. But that wasn't what happened. As the mercury touched the spot where the arsenic had settled months ago, the metal didn't turn bright. It turned a deep iridescent black. It was a dark, oily stain that seemed to grow the more Elias rubbed. It was as if the goblet itself were bleeding the truth. Stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He breathed in the toxic air, his lungs burning, but he couldn't take his eyes off the stain. It was a chemical reaction Thorne hadn't anticipated. The master thought he was cleaning his past, but he was actually highlighting his guilt. The black ring at the bottom of the goblet was a permanent record of the poison that had killed Julian Thorne. Elias leaned back, gasping for air. He looked at his hands. They were starting to tremble, a mirror of the master's own affliction. He knew he was being poisoned. He knew every minute spent in this room was shaving years off his life. But as he looked at the blackened silver, a cold, hard resolve took hold of him. He wasn't going to die a silent victim in a dark cellar. He was going to turn this silver into a noose. But the clock was ticking. Judge Sterling was due to arrive in less than 48 hours. Silus would be checking on the work soon. If he saw the black stain, he would realize the plan had failed. He would destroy the goblet, and Elias would never leave this cellar alive. Elias heard a sound outside the door. The heavy, uneven footfalls of Silus Thorne. The master was coming to check on his handiwork. Elias quickly threw a dry cloth over the goblet and picked up a silver tray, pretending to polish it with a fervor he didn't feel. His lungs screamed for fresh air, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. The key turned in the lock. The door swung open, and the stench of the mercury fumes rushed out into the hallway. Silus stood there, a handkerchief held over his nose. His eyes narrowed as he peered into the gloom. "Is it done?" Silus demanded, his voice muffled. Elias didn't look up. He kept his head down, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "The trays are coming along, master, but the silver is stubborn. It takes time to get the shine you want." Silus stepped into the room, coughing. He looked at the shining trays on the table, his eyes gleaming with a sick sort of satisfaction. He didn't notice the way Elias's hand was gripping the edge of the table to stay upright. He didn't see the jar of paste sitting dangerously close to the edge. "Make it perfect." "Elias," Silus hissed, "the judge expects the best. And remember the rags. Give them to Toby. I want this room cleared of everything by tomorrow night." Silus backed out of the room, locking the door once more. Elias collapsed onto the stool, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged wheeze. He looked at the covered goblet. He had a plan, but it was a desperate one. He needed to hide the evidence of the reaction until the very moment the judge sat down at the table. He needed to make Silus believe the plan was working. But as the mercury continued to seep into his system, Elias realized he was in a race he might not win. His fingertips were losing feeling. The candle on the table seemed to be dancing in a fog. He looked at the black stain on the goblet and then at the jar of poison. He had to be smarter than the man who owned him. He had to use the master's own arrogance against him. Elias reached for a piece of lead-based solder he had found in the repair kit. If he could create a fake, if he could swap the real goblet for something that looked identical but stayed bright, he might buy himself the time he needed. But where would he hide the real proof? And would Clara be brave enough to help him when the time came? The shadows in the cellar seemed to grow longer, and the silence was broken only by the sound of Elias's labored breathing. The silver was beautiful, expensive, and deadly, and as the night wore on, the man who knew the truth began to weave a trap out of the very poison meant to kill him. Silus Thorne thought he was the master of his domain, but he was about to learn that some stains go deeper than the surface. The silver doesn't lie, and Elias was going to make sure the judge heard every word it had to say. The air in the cellar had turned into a thick, invisible poison. Every breath Elias took felt like swallowing needles. The metallic taste in his mouth wasn't just from the silver anymore. It was the taste of his own body breaking down. Silus Thorne thought he had planned the perfect crime. He would use the butler's own dedication to the house to kill him. He would turn the act of cleaning into an execution. But what Silus didn't realize was that a man who has spent his life in the shadows sees more than the one who stands in the light. Elias looked at the blackened goblet. The iridescent ring at the bottom was more than a chemical reaction. It was a confession written in metal. He knew he couldn't leave it out. If Silus saw that black stain, the game would be over before the judge even arrived. With hands that were starting to twitch against his will, Elias reached for the heavy charcoal bin in the corner of the cellar. He buried the real Thorne goblet deep beneath the jagged chunks of coal. It was the only place the master would never look. Silus Thorne didn't touch coal. He didn't touch anything that might stain his hands. But hiding the truth was only half the battle. Elias needed a decoy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dull piece of lead piping he had scavenged from the plumbing repairs months ago. He had been preparing for a moment like this, though he hadn't known exactly what form the master's cruelty would take. He began to shape the lead, using a heavy stone from the cellar wall to hammer it into a rough approximation of the goblet's base. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be bright. The problem was the time. The Mercury was working faster than Elias had anticipated. His vision was beginning to swim, the edges of the room blurring into a grey haze. His heart would suddenly race, then skip a beat, sending a cold shiver down his spine. This was the madness the old folks talked about. The shaking, the fear, the loss of self. Silus was already showing the signs, but Elias was trapped in the source of it. Every minute in that cellar was a nail in his coffin. Just as he finished polishing the lead decoy to a deceptive shine, he heard the heavy bolt of the cellar door slide back. It wasn't the master's heavy, erratic step this time. It was lighter, more cautious. The door creaked open, and a sliver of light from the kitchen above spilled down the stairs. Clara, the housekeeper, stood there. She held a small tray with a cup of water and a piece of dry bread. Her face was pale, her eyes darting toward the hallway behind her. She hurried down the steps, her voice a frantic whisper. "Alas, you have to get out of here. I smelled it from the hallway. That paste, it's the same stuff he was mixing in the shed. The dogs that went near it were dead by morning." Elias took the water, his hand shaking so violently that half of it spilled before it reached his lips. "I can't leave, Clara. He's got the key and the judge is coming." Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "He's losing his mind, Elias. I saw him in the library. He was talking to the empty chair where Master Julian used to sit. He was screaming at the air, telling it to stay clean. Then he started searching your quarters. He's looking for something. He thinks you took something from Julian's room before he died." Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Silus wasn't just trying to kill him. He was looking for any piece of evidence Julian might have left behind. A letter, a note, a different vial of medicine. Silus was haunted by the possibility that his brother had known the end was coming. But what Silus didn't know was that Julian hadn't left a note. He had left something better, the residue in the goblet. "Listen to me, Clara," Elias said, his voice cracking. "The rags, the ones I've been using, they're full of that silver poison. When Toby comes to collect them, tell him to take them to the old well, not the fire. Tell him to drop them deep. Silus will check the ash pile, and if he sees them there, he'll think the evidence is gone. But we need those rags later. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. "He'll kill you for this, Elias. He's already telling the judge that you've caught the same fever Julian had. He's setting the stage for your burial." "Let him talk," Elias hissed, a sudden spark of defiance lighting up his dimming eyes. "The silver doesn't lie. Just get that water to me when you can, and keep him away from the coal bin." Clara disappeared back up the stairs, the door clicking shut. Elias was alone again, the silence of the cellar pressing in on him. He looked at the lead decoy. In the dim candle light, it looked enough like the Thorne silver to pass a quick inspection. He placed it on the display tray, surrounded by the genuine forks and spoons he had already cleaned. It was a gamble. If Silus touched it, he would know the weight was wrong. If he looked too closely, he would see the lack of detail in the crest. But Silus was currently blinded by his own deteriorating mind. Suddenly the house above erupted in a flurry of activity. Elias could hear the muffled sounds of horses, the shouting of stable hands, and the heavy thud of the front door. The judge had arrived. He was early. The timing was a disaster. Elias wasn't finished. The mercury fumes were reaching a peak, and he could feel a dull, rhythmic thumping in his ears that matched the beat of his heart. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of water. He collapsed back onto the stool, his head resting on the cold stone of the table. He just needed a moment, just a second of clear air, but there was no air in the Thorne cellar. There was only the smell of the river, the rot, and the silver. Above him, Silus Thorne was putting on his best coat, his shaking hands fumbling with the silver buttons. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror and saw a stranger. His skin was shallow, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, which was true. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Julian's face. He saw the way the wine had spilled across the white linen. He saw the goblet. Silus marched toward the cellar door. He needed that silver. He needed the judge to see the Thorne legacy in all its glory. He needed to prove that everything was under control. He unlocked the door and stormed down the stairs, his boots clattering on the stone. "Elias, bring it up now," Silus bellowed. Elias forced himself to his feet. He grabbed the tray with the decoy goblet and the genuine silverware. He moved slowly, every step a monumental effort of will. He reached the bottom of the stairs just as Silus reached the table. The master didn't even look at Elias. He looked at the tray, his eyes fixed on the lead decoy. "Beautiful," Silus whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of triumph and madness. "Look at that shine. I told you that paste was the best in the south. It's blinding, isn't it?" Silus reached out to grab the goblet. Elias held his breath, his heart stopping in his chest. If Silus picked it up, the weight would give it away. The lead was far heavier than the silver gilt original, but Silus's hand stopped inches from the metal. His fingers began to twitch violently, the Mercury's signature. He pulled his hand back, tucking it into his waistcoat to hide the tremor. "Carry it up, Elias. Set the table. The judge is hungry, and I want him to see what a Thorne dinner looks like." Elias nodded, not trusting his voice. He followed Silus up the stairs, leaving the toxic air of the cellar behind, but the relief was short-lived. As he stepped into the dining room, the bright light of the afternoon sun hit him like a physical blow. He swayed, the tray tilting dangerously. Judge Sterling was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, grey hair, grey eyes, and a mouth that rarely smiled. He watched Elias approach with a keen, observant gaze. He was a man who spent his life weighing evidence, and he saw things that Silus, in his madness, missed. "Your man looks ill, Thorne," the judge said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "That's a deep pallor. Are you sure it's safe for him to be handling the food?" Silus laughed, a high, nervous sound that set Elias's teeth on edge. "Just a bit of summer exhaustion, Judge. He's been working hard to make sure everything is perfect for your arrival. He's a loyal soul, perhaps too loyal." Elias began to set the table. He placed the genuine forks and knives with meticulous care. Then he reached for the lead decoy. He placed it directly in front of the judge's place setting. He wanted the man of the law to have the closest look at the lie. As he moved around the table, Elias caught Clarara's eye in the doorway. She was watching him, her face a mask of terror. She saw the way his hands were shaking. She saw the sweat soaking through his shirt. She knew he was dying, but she also saw the charcoal dust on the hem of his trousers. She knew where the real goblet was. The dinner began. It was a tense affair. Silus drank heavily, his glass clinking against his teeth as he tried to steady his hand. He talked incessantly, spinning a web of lies about the plantation's success and Julian's peaceful passing. The judge said little, his eyes moving from Silas's twitching face to the silver on the table. "This goblet," the judge said suddenly, picking up the lead decoy. Elias felt the world tilt. The judge turned the piece over in his hands. "It's remarkably bright, but it has a strange feel to it. It's heavy, unusually so for silver of this period." Silas froze his wine glass halfway to his lips. "It's a family heirloom, Judge. Purest silver from the old country. It's the weight of history you're feeling." The judge frowned. He ran a thumb over the crest. "The detail is a bit soft. Perhaps it's been polished too much, or perhaps the air in this house is harder on metal than I thought." Silas's face turned a deep, angry red. "Are you questioning the quality of my table's sterling? I assure you that silver is as real as the land we stand on." "I question everything, Thorne," the judge replied calmly. "It's my profession, but let us toast to the memory of your brother." Silas stood up, his legs wobbling. He grabbed his own glass, but his gaze was fixed on the decoy in the judge's hand. He was starting to realize something was wrong. His eyes moved to Elias, who was standing stiffly against the wall. The master's paranoia was flaring up. He looked at the decoy again, and then he looked at Elias's hands. "Wait," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Elias, where is the cleaning paste? The jar I gave you." "In the cellar, Master," Elias replied, his voice barely audible. "And the rags?" "Toby took them, Master, to the fire as you ordered." Silas's eyes narrowed. He looked at the judge, who was still holding the lead decoy. Then he looked back at Elias. He saw the defiance in the butler's eyes, a spark that shouldn't be there in a dying man. "You're lying," Silas hissed. He lunged across the table, knocking over a candelabra. He grabbed the lead decoy from the judge's hand and slammed it down onto the mahogany surface. The soft metal deformed instantly, the base flattening out under the force of the blow. It didn't ring like silver. It thudded like a dead weight. The room went deathly silent. The judge stood up, his eyes cold and sharp. "That isn't silver, Thorne. That's lead. Why would you have a lead counterfeit at your table?" Silas turned on Elias, his face a mask of pure Mercury-induced rage. "Where is it? Where is the family silver? You stole it. You're trying to ruin me." He reached for the carving knife on the table. Elias didn't move. He couldn't. His body was finally giving out. But as Silas moved toward him, a new sound echoed through the house. It was the sound of Toby, the stable boy, screaming from the yard, "Master Thorne, the well." "Something's happened at the well." The judge looked from Silas to the window. "What is he talking about? What's at the well?" Silas paused, the knife trembling in his hand. He had told Toby to burn the rags. If Toby was at the well, it meant the plan had changed. It meant the evidence wasn't ash. It was wet, toxic, and very much real. "Go see what the boy wants, Elias," the judge commanded. "And Thorne, put that knife down. We have things to discuss." But Silas wasn't listening. He was staring at the lead decoy on the table, the realization sinking in that he had been tricked by the very man he was trying to kill. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, he saw not a slave, but a witness. "I'll kill you myself," Silas whispered. But before he could take a step, he was hit by a violent coughing fit. He doubled over, blood splattering onto the white tablecloth, the same white linen that had been stained by Julian's wine 6 months ago. The mercury was no longer a slow poison. It was a fire in his veins. The judge stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the blood on the table. "You're a sick man, Silas, in more ways than one." The turning point had arrived. The lie was breaking. But Elias knew the real proof was still buried in the coal. He had to stay alive long enough to bring it into the light. The judge was watching, but the master was still dangerous, and the poison was still in the air. What the judge didn't know yet was that the blood on the table and the lead on the tray were just the beginning. The real horror was still hidden in the dark, waiting for the right moment to turn the Thorne legacy into a tombstone. Silus Thorne thought he could bury his crimes in a slave's lungs, but the earth was already spitting back his secrets. The lead decoy had flattened on the table, a dull thud that signaled the end of Thorne's prestige and the beginning of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But the real danger wasn't the fake silver. It was the truth hidden in the dark, and it was about to be dragged into the flickering candle light of the dining hall. What Silus didn't know was that every lie he told was a shovel digging his own grave. The dining room felt like a pressure cooker. The judge sat like a statue, his eyes fixed on the blood Silus had coughed onto the white linen. It was a dark, jagged stain, almost identical in shape to the one Julian had left 6 months ago. Silus was gasping, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his composure. He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand, but the tremors were no longer just in his fingers. His entire arm was shaking, a rhythmic, uncontrollable jerking that made his sleeve rattle. "Explain this, Thorne," the judge said, his voice cold as a winter creek. "A lead counterfeit on your table, a butler who looks like he's walking toward his own funeral, and now blood. This house doesn't smell like a plantation. It smells like an apothecary's shop after a fire." Silus tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He stole it. "Elias, he's been bitter since Julian died. He took the family silver and sold it to some trader on the river. He made that lead piece to hide his theft until I could be ruined." It was a desperate lie, a classic move from a man who had run out of ground to stand on. Silus pointed a crooked, shaking finger at Elias. "Search his quarters. Search the quarters of every soul on this land. You'll find the money or you'll find the trader. He's a thief, Sterling, a common murderous thief." Elias leaned against the sideboard, his breath coming in shallow, ragged whistles. The world was spinning. He could see the judge's face, then the ceiling, then the floor. He felt a strange heat in his fingertips, a burning sensation that told him the Mercury was winning, but he couldn't let go. Not yet. He looked at Silus and saw the fear behind the madness. Silus wasn't just afraid of the law, he was afraid of the dead. He kept glancing at Julian's empty chair as if he expected his brother to start laughing. Suddenly, the door to the dining room burst open. Toby, the stable boy, ran in. He was holding something wrapped in a piece of burlap, his face strewn with dirt and tears. He didn't wait for permission to speak. He didn't care about the rules of the house anymore. "Master, the well, the old well by the creek." Toby cried out. "The dogs. They found the rags. 2 of the hounds are down, master. They licked the water dripping from these." Toby dropped the burlap onto the floor. It fell open, revealing the heavy grey, stained rags Elias had used in the cellar. The smell hit the room instantly, that sharp, cloying metallic scent of raw mercury. It was so strong it made the judge cover his nose. The judge stood up and walked toward the rags. He didn't touch them, but he leaned down, his eyes narrowing. "Mercury," he whispered. "This isn't silver polish, this is raw cinnabar extract. Thorne, why are your cleaning rags soaked in enough poison to kill a village?" Silas's face went from red to a sickly translucent white. I told him to use the best. I didn't know. The chemist must have cheated me. The chemist didn't lock Elias in the cellar for 16 hours. Her voice said it was Clara. She was standing in the doorway, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her voice was trembling, but it didn't break. She had spent years watching Silus Thorne destroy everything he touched, and she had finally reached her breaking point. "He gave Elias that paste," Clara said, looking directly at the judge. "He told him to stay in that room until the silver was blinding. He told Toby to burn the rags because he said they were diseased, but the boy was scared. He didn't want to touch them, so he threw them down the dry well instead." The judge turned his gaze back to Silus. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the rings on Silas's shaking hand. "Is that true, Thorne?" the judge asked. Silus didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the rags on the floor as if they were snakes ready to strike. He realized then that he had failed. He hadn't destroyed the evidence. He had only moved it. And now the very poison he had used to try and silence Elias was being presented as an exhibit in his own trial. The silver. Elias gasped, the words bubbling up through the fluid in his lungs. The real silver, it isn't sold. Silus lunged for Elias, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Shut up. Shut your mouth, you lying dog. The judge stepped between them, his hand resting on the hilt of the small sword he wore for travel. Let him speak, Thorne. If the silver isn't sold, where is it? Elias pointed a trembling hand toward the floor. The cellar. The cobbin. He wanted it clean, but it turned black. The silver turned black. Judge black. The judge frowned. Silver doesn't turn black from Mercury. Not unless he stopped. He was a man of the law, but he had studied the sciences in his youth. He knew that Mercury was a reactive metal. He knew it sought out other elements, and he knew what Julian Thorne had supposedly died of. Unless there was something else on the metal, the judge finished, something like arsenic. Silus let out a low animal growl. He turned and ran. He didn't head for the door. He headed for the sideboard, reaching for a heavy glass decanter of brandy. He swung it like a club, shattering it against the wall, and grabbed a jagged shard of glass. He was a cornered animal, driven by a brain that was literally rotting from the inside out. I built this. Silus screamed, his voice cracking. I am the master of this house. My brother was weak. He was going to give it all away to the church and the schools. I saved this family. The confession hung in the air like a thick smoke. Silus didn't even realize he had said it. He was too busy waving the glass shard at the judge, his eyes wide and vacant. Toby, the judge said calmly, never taking his eyes off Silus, go to the cellar. Get the silver from the coal bin, bring the goblet first, and you, Clara, get the overseer. Tell him to bring the irons. No, Silus shrieked. He tried to move toward Toby, but his legs failed him again. He crashed into the dining table, sending the plates and the lead decoy flying. He lay on the floor, his body twitching in a full-blown neurological seizure, his heels drummed against the floorboards, a frantic, hollow sound that echoed through the room. Elias watched him. He felt no pity. He felt only a cold, hard satisfaction. The poison in his own system was heavy, and he knew his days were numbered. But he had lived long enough to see the mask fall. Toby returned minutes later. He was covered in black cold dust, and in his hands he held the real Thorne goblet. It was a beautiful piece, but as he set it on the table in front of the judge, the horror became clear. The bottom of the goblet was stained a deep iridescent black. It wasn't tarnish. It was a permanent chemical scar. The mercury paste had reacted with the arsenic residue that had been dried into the fine scratches of the silver, creating a mark that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. The judge picked up the goblet. He looked at the black ring, then at the man seizing on the floor, and finally at Elias. You knew, the judge said. I saw the wine that night, Elias whispered. I smelled the bitter almonds in the dregs, but nobody listens to a butler. They will now, the judge replied. But the victory felt hollow as Elias felt his vision start to darken. He had reached the finish line, but the price of the race was his life. He looked at the goblet one last time. It was the centerpiece of the Thorne family's pride, and now it was the evidence that would erase their name from history. The overseer arrived with the irons, but they weren't needed yet. Silus was unconscious, his body finally exhausted by the chemicals and the rage. They dragged him out like a sack of grain, his expensive coat trailing in the dust and the blood. The judge turned to Elias. We need to get you to a doctor. There is a man in town who knows about the heavy metals. He might be able to help. Elias shook his head slowly. He knew the truth. He could feel the mercury in his bones. He could feel the way his mind was starting to drift, the memories of the plantation blurring into a soft grey fog. The silver, Elias said, his voice a mere ghost of itself. Check the bottom of the decanter, too. The one he broke. You'll find the same mark. The judge looked at the shattered glass on the floor. Sure enough, where the brandy had pulled around the silver collar of the bottle, The metal was beginning to turn that same sickly black. Silus had been poisoning himself for months, using the same decanter he had used to kill his brother, never realizing that the residue was still there, waiting for the mercury in his own system to find it. The logic of the error was perfect. A man blinded by greed forgets that poison kills the hand that holds the cup. But as the judge began to take notes, a new problem emerged. Silus Thorne's lawyers were powerful men. The estate was vast, and in the Mississippi Delta, a slave's word was still a fragile thing, even with physical evidence. The judge knew that for this to stick, for Silus to actually face the gallows, he needed more than just a stained cup. He needed a witness who could survive long enough to stand in a courtroom. "Elias," the judge said, leaning in close, "stay with me. Don't close your eyes. I need you to tell me everything from the moment Julian sat down at that table. I need every detail." But Elias was looking past the judge. He was looking at the window where the sun was setting over the fields. He could see the silhouettes of the other workers coming in from the harvest. He could see the future, a world without Silus Thorne. The problem was Silus wasn't the only one who had a secret. As the judge started his investigation, he noticed something in the coal bin that Toby had missed. It wasn't a piece of silver, it was a small leather-bound book, Julian Thorne's diary. If Silus had found that book, he would have burned it. But Julian had hidden it where he knew his brother would never look. And in those pages was the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that would turn a simple murder into a conspiracy that reached far beyond the Thorne plantation. The judge reached for the book, but as his hand touched the leather, he heard a sound from the hallway. It wasn't the overseer or Clara. It was the sound of a carriage pulling up to the front of the house. A carriage with the seal of the state governor. The Thorne family had friends in high places, and they weren't about to let a stained goblet bring down their empire. The race wasn't over. It had just moved from the cellar to the halls of power, and Elias was running out of time. The judge tucked the diary into his coat and looked at Elias. "The silver doesn't lie," he whispered. "But men do, and some men will kill to keep the lie alive." The door opened, and a man in a tall silk hat stepped into the room. He didn't look at the blood or the rags. He looked at the judge. "I hear there's been a misunderstanding, Sterling," the man said. The air in the room grew cold again. The truth was out, but the justice was still a long way off. And in the corner, Elias closed his eyes, praying that the black stain on the silver would be enough to light the way. The governor's man, a senator named Langdon, stepped into the dining room like he owned the air everyone else was breathing. He didn't look at the blood on the tablecloth or the man twitching on the floor. He looked at Judge Sterling, his eyes hard and calculating. He was there to make sure the Thorne name didn't become a stain on the state's political fabric. But what he didn't count on was that some stains are made of chemicals, not just reputations. The silver goblet sat on the table between them, a blackened witness that couldn't be bribed or intimidated. This was no longer just a murder. It was a war between the law and the men who thought they were above it. Langdon flicked a speck of dust from his sleeve. "This is a sensitive matter, Sterling. Silus Thorne is a pillar of this community. If he's ill, he needs a sanitarium, not a scandal. We can handle this quietly. There's no need for the local papers to hear about poisoned silver or family squabbles." Judge Sterling didn't blink. He reached into his coat and pulled out Julian's diary, laying it next to the blackened goblet. "Murder isn't a squabble, Senator, and this silver isn't just dirty. It's a crime scene. Silus Thorne didn't just kill his brother. He's been methodically poisoning his butler to cover his tracks. Look at the man." The judge pointed to Elias. The butler was slumped against the wall, his skin a ghostly grey, his breathing a wet rattling sound that filled the pauses in the conversation. Elias was the living proof of Silas's cruelty, a man dying from the very air he had been forced to breathe. The word of a slave against a Thorne. Langdon laughed, though there was no humor in it. You know as well as I do that won't hold up in any court in this state. The evidence is circumstantial at best. A stained cup, a sick servant. That's not a case. That's a tragedy of the climate. It's not just the servant the judge counted. Look at the master. 2 overseers dragged Silus Thorne back into the room. He was conscious now, but barely. His head lolled from side to side, and his hands were tied behind his back, yet they still jerked with a rhythmic, violent twitching. His eyes were wide, the pupils fixed, staring at things no one else could see. He started to mutter a stream of nonsense about silver wine and the smell of bitter almonds. Mercury poisoning is a specific beast. Senator, the judge said, his voice rising with indignation. It rots the mind before it kills the body. It causes tremors that a man cannot fake. Silus didn't just handle the poison. He lived in it. He's been using that silver decanter for months, drinking from the residue of the arsenic he used on Julian. He was so paranoid about being discovered that he poisoned himself trying to scrub away the ghost of his brother. Langdon walked over to the table and picked up the goblet. He looked at the iridescent black ring at the bottom. He was a smart man. He knew what a chemical reaction looked like. He also knew that if Julian's diary contained dates and descriptions of the wine's taste, the sudden fever story would fall apart. The diary mentions the wine. Sterling said, as if reading Langdon's mind. Julian wrote that Silus insisted on a toast every night. He wrote about the metallic tang in the cup. He even wrote that he feared his brother was trying to cleanse the inheritance. It's all here, the motive, the method, and the physical proof. Silus let out a sudden high-pitched shriek. It won't come off. I scrubbed and I scrubbed. The silver is black. Julian's heart was black. I had to do it. The confession was raw, loud, and witnessed by everyone in the room, including the senator's own carriage driver who was standing in the doorway. Langdon's face shifted. He saw the tide turning. He wasn't a man to go down with a sinking ship. He was a man who knew when to cut his losses and claim he was the one who found the leak. It seems, Langdon said, his voice suddenly smooth and formal, that the situation is more dire than I was led to believe. If Master Thorne has truly lost his faculties and committed these atrocities, the state will, of course, demand justice. The state will get it, Sterling replied. And so will Elias. The judge turned to the overseer. Take Silus Thorne to the county jail. I want a doctor to examine his tremors and document them as evidence of mercury exposure, and get a wagon for Elias. He's going to the infirmary in town, and he's going as a free man under my protection. Silus was dragged out of the house, his screams echoing through the grand hallway he had once walked with such arrogance. He had killed for this house, and now it was a tomb he would never inhabit again. The Thorne name, which he had tried so hard to protect with poison and lies, was now a curse that would be whispered in the Delta for generations. But the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, the Thorne plantation became a site of investigation. The judge brought in a chemist from the university who confirmed the reaction between the arsenic and the mercury. They found the remaining vials of poison hidden in a loose floorboard in Silus's study, vials that matched the chemical signature found in the goblet. Elias spent 3 weeks in the infirmary. The doctors didn't think he would make it. The mercury had done a number on his lungs and his nervous system. But Elias was a man who had survived the worst the Delta had to throw at him for 38 years. He was stubborn. He drank the fluids they gave him. He breathed the fresh air of the town, and slowly the tremors in his hands began to fade, though they would never truly go away. During his recovery, the judge visited him every day. He brought the papers. Because of Elias's role in exposing a capital crime and his status as a victim of attempted murder by chemical means, the court had granted him his manumission. He was no longer the property of the Thorne estate. He was a witness for the prosecution, and he was a free man. The trial was short. Silus Thorne didn't even have the mental capacity to enter a plea. He sat in the courtroom, his hands clicking against the wooden railing, his eyes fixed on the silver goblet that sat on the evidence table. Every time the sun hit the metal and reflected the black stain, Silus would flinch as if he'd been struck. He was found guilty of the murder of Julian Thorne and the attempted murder of Elias. Because of his deteriorating mental state caused by his own hand, he was sentenced to a state prison for the criminally insane. He would spend the rest of his life in a stone cell, surrounded by the silence he had tried so hard to enforce. He lost the estate, his wealth, and eventually his ability to speak. He died 3 years later, still trying to polish the invisible silver on the walls of his cell. Clara and Toby were given small pensions from the sale of the Thornelands, which were broken up and sold at auction. The big house, once a symbol of power, was left to rot. People said the air inside was still sour, that the smell of mercury and bitter almonds never truly left the walls. On the day Elias was finally strong enough to leave the infirmary, he walked to the edge of the river. He held his freedom papers in his hand, the ink dark and permanent. He looked at his fingers. They still had a slight tremble, a permanent reminder of the 16 hours he spent in the cellar, but his lungs felt clear. The wet shroud of the delta didn't feel like a weight anymore. It just felt like home. He looked back at the distant silhouette of the Thorne chimneys. He had been a butler, a slave, and a victim. But in the end, he had been the one to hold the mirror up to the master's face. He had used the very tools of his oppression, the silver and the polish, to break his chains. The silver didn't lie. Silus Thorne had thought he was cleaning his past, but he was only highlighting his guilt. He had forgotten the most basic rule of the world. You can't scrub away the truth when it's etched into the metal of your life. Elias turned away from the plantation and started walking toward the town. He didn't have much, just the clothes on his back and the papers in his pocket. But for the first time in 38 years, he wasn't looking at the floorboards. He was looking at the horizon. Greed leaves a stain that no chemical can remove. Silus Thorne had tried to wash his hands in mercury, but all he did was ensure that everyone would see the blackness underneath. The Thorne legacy ended in a dark cellar, but Elias's story was just beginning. Justice in the Delta was rare, but that summer it shined as bright as polished silver and just as hard. If this story of truth and survival moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more accounts of justice being served. Share this video with those who believe that the truth will always find its way into the light. And let us know in the comments, what city or state are you watching from? Your support helps us tell the stories that history tried to bury.